Welcome to Exhibition. And hello, Sophie and Ann Cape.
Hi, Richard.
Hello, Richard. Nice to see you.
Great to see you both, and thank you for both being part of this discussion. Your exhibition is An Unending Shadow at the Shoalhaven Regional Gallery in Nowra in New South Wales. And it's an exhibition which focuses very broadly on the issues surrounding dementia and Alzheimer's disease. What was the genesis of the exhibition? How did you and why did you decide to do this together?
Actually, I was approached first by John Cheeseman at the Mossman Gallery about doing this. And I have to say, I was fairly apprehensive about it initially and sort of procrastinated on the idea, I think, for at least a year or so. And
so this was, if I can just clarify, this was the Mossman Gallery in Sydney, Regional Gallery, and this initial approach to you was quite a few years ago now.
It actually was. And then after some time, John asked if Sophie'd like to come on board as well. So after I put it to Sophie, she was very enthusiastic about the idea and thought, that's fantastic. I think we should do this. It'd be really good to do this together. I was still a bit reticent, but I have to say, Sophie, I think, found it harder than I did in the long run. By the time she sort of approached the whole thing, it was really difficult thing to do.
Well, it's a hugely challenging area because Bill, your husband, and Sophie, your father, was in the midst of that struggle at the time. So, Sophie, why were you so keen to come on board and try to bring some works together with your mother?
Well, I hadn't fully considered the what it actually meant to make this exhibition, so I was very gung-ho from the start. But when it came down to it, it took me months before I could put pencil to paper, because I hadn't realised how many walls I had built up around this issue to protect myself from the hate, the anger, the frustration. I mean, Dad had been sick for a long time, and to deal with this, I had to break down all those walls and I had to go to some very dark places to understand the issue better, to understand myself and to understand him. And I think one of the beautiful things about being an artist is you can turn adversity into the sublime. But to do so, you have to go on quite a traumatic journey. Well, I had to because it was so personal. But the result was very cathartic, but it was quite a hard journey to go on. And I really went there. And you can see that in my self-portrait. But I had to, I guess I went back to do it. I went back and explored Dad's past. And I mean, I idolized him, absolutely worshipped him as a child. And that man was gone and I couldn't really remember him very well. And so I researched his stories, his history. He was quite an amazing man. And that was hugely heartbreaking. And thinking about his isolation, his horror, his fear, the unknown, what he would be going through was just devastating. And I went through all of that as well. So just, it gave me a huge amount of empathy towards him, having to put myself into his position. And that was a really difficult thing to go through, but it helped me sympathize with him a lot more rather than being angry at him all the time. So, yeah.
So, and as Sophie has just shared with us, and you know, thank you for that, Sophie. And it must have been a very difficult journey for you as well, but you perhaps seem to approach it in a different way to Sophie.
Well, I did. I perhaps sort of took it on the surface. I was involved in a group which was a group called Frontier, and they're, I think now with the Australian Brain and Mind Institute at Sydney University. They were at New South Wales, but I'd go to a group there regularly, and there were a whole lot of participants there, carers, who who actually had very different experience, even though their partners had the same diagnosis. It could have manifested itself in different ways. And it was actually I thought, this would be a waste of time. Nothing is going to change anything. But it was very helpful, meeting with these people and hearing what was happening with them. And so that's where I decided to start on this exhibition, just on how those people were dealing with their partner, in just a group of portraits of them.
There's one work, Deb and Davy, and we see that there is a portrait of the person experiencing the dementia, and their face is painted but also drawn and separately. What's happening there?
Well, that was sort of the self being lost in a way. It wasn't actually, just to clarify, there are a lot of, over 200 different types of dementia. And we were particularly dealing with a type of dementia called frontotemporal lobe, which is called a FTD commonly, which is actually quite different from Alzheimer's, in that it affects different specific areas of these people. And some people, the left frontal lobe controls your speech and writing generally. And in that particular portrait, Deb and Davy, he was this really fit young man. It's often characterized by an early onset dementia too, FTD. And he would go out, exercise, bike riding, but he'd lost his power of speech and he couldn't write. So he had this sort of locked-in syndrome. And he was this young, relatively young, fit man, and with a young wife and young family. And she was obviously very caring of him.
Let's go to one of your works, Sophie. And first of all, we must say that your works are very large, whereas Anne's vary in scale. Some of them are large, but yours go from floor to ceiling. Why is that size important to you before we start talking about the content?
I get asked that a lot. I think it's because my works come from a very personal place. They're very emotionally charged. And so I need this sort of like emotional self-portraits. So I need to be inside the work when I make them, because they're coming from an internal place. So I kind of work from the inside out of the canvas. So they're very sort of performative kind of action paintings when I make them. So that's why they're so expressive and energetic. And I guess it's me sort of
dealing physically with some sort of emotional trauma.
Yeah.
The process of creating the works is and looks literally like a physical wrestling match or a fight or a competition.
Yes. Yeah. So for me, it's not, the end product isn't that important to me. It's the process of making it that I find cathartic and important.
Take us inside. You were just saying that in the making, you go inside the work in a sense. Take us inside a shiny bone under a heavy light.
Like I said, it was very difficult figuring out how to access the subject. So I started by basically with words. I wrote about Dad's past, his stories, my memories of him, his achievements. I just wrote and wrote and wrote on the canvas and then obliterated it again and again and again. Basically, I suppose, as a metaphor or a symbol of what was happening with his very life, of the way it was just disappearing before him and before us and before me. And eventually he started to come, a portrait of him started to come out of those words. And I guess the portrait, I mean, you could or couldn't see, you may not even see the face there, but it's his face disintegrating basically into the canvas and coming out of the canvas. He sort of is there and isn't there. It's him sort of crumbling, I suppose.
And as well as that very powerful emotional content, the physical content of this, and indeed other works of yours, is hugely varied. You talk about the action in the making of it, but there's a tremendous amount of energy in the actual components. Tell us a little about the materials and the variety of materials you use.
Yes, I use generally locally found materials. So because the works are so big, and I stand right in the middle of them and throw paint around quite violently, I have to work outside. So I travel out to areas in the landscape and kind of sleep out there for weeks and let the nature sort of infiltrate them. And I never really know what's going to happen. So it's kind of me fighting against the elements as well. So I might go to sleep and wake up and the canvas is gone. And I have to find it, or it's up a tree or down a cliff, or I've lost, I don't know how many works around Australia. It's ridiculous. But, they get rained on, and then it's exciting because then it turns into something else. And I love that battle that I'm constantly fighting, that excitement of never knowing what's going to happen, and that sort of tension and that wall that I've got going with the elements. So that also adds another element to it. It's not like in a studio where everything is considered. I never know what's going to happen. I might throw some paint in this direction, ends up over there, and then I've got to deal with that. And that, for me, adds a level of excitement and challenge to it as well.
Tell us the story of the work with the title "Echoes Through 1,000 Labyrinths Flown," which is a joint work. And given how differently you work, that must have been pretty interesting.
It was very challenging, I have to say. My idea of working together was a bit different to Sophie's, in that I thought we would work together, at the same time. But no, she wanted me to have a go, and then she'd have a go. So it started out as a very figurative piece, as you can imagine. And then she'd come and obliterate most of what I'd done. And it was a bit of a fight to the finish, I have to say. I think at one stage I came home and she had it in the backyard hosing it off. And I thought, I spent hours on that. But she said, I put some colour on, I didn't like it, so I had to go, irrespective of the hours of work I'd put into it. So it became quite fierce. I'd be fighting to get my images into there, and she'd be over the top. So it was amusing to say.
So I suppose in a way it was whoever got the last go, so to speak, would have the major surface.
Exactly.
It was fun, but see, I have more of a search and destroy technique, I suppose, and Mum sort of builds up the work. So it was constant this tug of war going on. So I'd work through the night and annihilate it, and Mum would work through the day and build it up, and it was this constant back and forth.
Yes.
It was fun.
Referring, Anne, to your figurative approach, and often quite formal and anatomically correct figurative approach, there are also a number of sketches, not full paintings, but sketches in the exhibition. Tell us about those, and about your practice of representing people's faces.
Well, I am drawn to drawing the human form, particularly the portrait and the face. It always intrigues me. And those sketches came about because I approached a lot of nursing homes, and if I could go in, that wasn't an easy thing to do, I have to say, to find somewhere where I could go in and draw. And I had to, of course, have the permission of the family of the person involved.
We were talking a little about portraits and the process of representing people's faces, making portraits of them. But there are also works in the exhibition from you, and which very much seem to be metaphorical or allegorical. Let's go to a couple briefly. How to Stop Time and Lacage. Now, Lacage actually seems to have a Marcel Marceau character in it.
It has that mime, that's probably a bit self-explanatory. And that sort of the feeling of trying to reach out, losing the power of speech, even though, of course, he was a fantastic mime, and that was what it was all about. It was just, there was a bit of a similarity of trying to communicate without a voice in more ways than one. That was sort of based around that.
And How to Stop Time?
That was the one.
It looks like a very powerful emotional work.
It was just with the hands and Bill's face, and I think we mentioned earlier, it's a couple of years or whatever since I did these works, and I have to say, coming back and looking at them now, I find them really difficult, because I can see so much more than in the works now that I did before in Bill's deterioration, and his striving and his terror in a way. That it was just based on the horror of, and the frustration of losing oneself.
You mentioned earlier, Sophie, about the essentially the pain in the self-portrait that you put together. Can you give us a little bit more of a sense of insight into the dynamics of what's happening in that work?
Well, it looks like a pretty angry work. It's quite violent, I suppose. It was very cathartic doing it. I feel much better having done it. I think it speaks for itself. I suppose what I wanted to do was create works that, even though they're extremely personal, that went to a place that was also, I guess, reached a universal sort of point that could speak to, through their abstraction, speak to other people, so that they could relate to them, not just about my pain, but that they could sort of access and understand. So, that's why I go more into the abstract rather than the literal. So, I've thrown everything at that, from bitumen to rust to blood to charcoal to, oh God, I think there's everything in there.
As Anne was saying a short time ago, there is a very definite portrait of Bill in the work How to Stop Time, but there is a portrait from you of your father in The Fierce Soul Begins to Splinter. What were you trying to catch of him in that work?
I found a beautiful portrait of my father when he was young and very handsome, and when he was a pilot in the Air Force. And again, this work started with the idea of the text and memories of him, and then I started pulling out a young portrait of him. And as I went, it started to splinter sort of through the centre. This one's very difficult to see his face in. But it sort of started cracking through the middle as I worked, and I don't know why, but that's what happened. And if you look closely, or if you stand back far enough, you can certainly see his face. I have an image of his original, the face that's in it.
Oh, have you got it handy?
Yeah.
Nice and still, yes, we can see.
Yeah. So that's where it comes from. So it was quite confronting drawing him as a young man. I don't remember him like that, obviously. But so I had a young version of him and the version of him that I was now dealing with. So I did Dad when he was young, Dad as present and demented, and then a portrait of me dealing with the current situation. So they were my three pivotal works.
In a broader sense, when people go to this exhibition, what are you hoping, Sophie, that they might come away from it feeling broadly?
I think dementia is, it affects
1,800 people a week or over, I think, are diagnosed with dementia in Australia.
And yet it's still quite, it's very poorly diagnosed. It's sort of shunned in society. It's sort of hidden behind closed doors. Everybody has been affected by it in some way. It's a very cruel disease, and we don't know much about it. And it's horrible. It's really horrible. And and people can be really cruel about it. And I think I would just like people to have a little bit of sympathy and understanding, and just give some time to people who suffer from dementia.
Anne, As you said, this exhibition first came together some years ago now at the Mossman Regional Gallery. How do both of you feel about seeing it brought back together 4 years or so later?
I think we'd welcome that because it was such a big thing to do it. And I think there is a long way for people to go with an awareness of dementia, as Sophie said. I mean, I think most people feel frightened, intimidated by seeing people that are, and they tend to shun them because they're frightened, probably. They just don't know how to deal with it. But I just, then people need to be encouraged to just acknowledge people. Just talk to them. Even if you don't get a response, just give them a smile or give them an acknowledgement. It means so much to people rather than just be as if they don't exist anymore.
All those years ago when the exhibition first was shown at Mossman, Bill was still alive. In fact, I remember us all being at the opening together. Can you share with others how he perhaps responded to the exhibition and what your thoughts were at that time about having that exhibition with Bill actually being part of it?
Look, he was very happy to be represented there, but he didn't seem to have an awareness of what it was really about. Sometimes when you're living with someone all the time, you credit them with more realization than they actually have. And we were very worried on the opening night because we had to make a speech and talk about dementia and Dad. And there's always a funny side. You've always got to find something to laugh at when you're in these situations. And we had arranged for one of Sophie's brothers to take him outside and distract him while we were making the speech. But, the time came, the gallery was packed, and Bill sat himself right in the front row. And there was no way he was going to move. He was so proud that he was there on the walls. He didn't really know what it was about. And so Sophie and I thought, we just got to do this, Anyway, so we did. We went ahead. And then afterwards, I went up to him and said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Do you think I could get up on that dais and tell my joke about the two ladies in the lift?" Totally irrelevant. But he loved the occasion. He loved everything about it. But he had no understanding of what it was about, which was lovely.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a relief.
Well, from that enormously difficult situation, a beautiful and superb and very powerful exhibition has been created, and it's wonderful to see it being shown once again. Sophie and Ann Cape, thanks very much for sharing that exhibition with us.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. It's nice to talk to you.
Yeah.